Good morning, all, and thank you for joining the call to discuss the straw proposal for the Commitment Cost Enhancements Tariff Clarification Initiative. My name is Christina Osborne from ISO Stakeholder Affairs. I'll be facilitating the call. We also have John Gooden, David Slotlow, Dennis Peters, and then Gabe Murtaugh is going to be presenting today. He's the policy lead for this initiative. We are recording the meeting. We're going to make that recording available out on the initiative webpage. That's where you'll also find the straw proposal as well as the presentation that we're going to be talking through today. So this is the agenda. Gabe is going to go over the timeline. He's going to provide some background on the Commitment Cost Enhancements Phase 3 initiative, including use-limited resources, conditionally available resources, and run-of-river resources. He'll talk about bidding obligations and also the applicability of rain and obligations, as well as notification of outages, and then finally the proposed tariff clarifications. We are going to take questions. We'll pause kind of throughout the call, take questions. If you do have a question, you can raise your hand by pressing pound 2. Please start by introducing yourself. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gabe.
Great. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone on the phone call. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate all of the feedback that we've gotten from the conversations we've had since the conclusion of the Commitment Cost Enhancements Phase 3 initiative. And the items that we've been discussing in between there. We look forward to a good conversation today and to moving this particular piece of the policy forward. As this is not only the meeting to discuss the straw proposal, it's also the official kickoff meeting for this policy. We'll go ahead and go through the timeline that we're anticipating wrapping up this policy. So today, obviously, December 10th, we're having a stakeholder call. Comments will be due on January 6th. This allows time for folks with the holiday schedule to make sure there's ample time to give a thorough and thoughtful response to everything that we've included. That we'll have as discussions in the stakeholder call today and that we've included in our straw proposal. In mid-January, we're hoping to publish a draft final proposal. In late January, we'll plan to have another stakeholder call to discuss the draft final proposal and hopefully the accompanying tariff language. Just as a note here, we don't expect the tariff language to change a whole lot from the tariff language we've already been talking about. But we'll continue to consider that as we receive stakeholder feedback on the initiative through this comments period. We will have final comments on the paper due in early February, and then we're planning to take this to the ISO Board of Governors in March at our March Board of Governors meeting, and then in April we will plan to file the tariff language changes at FERC, and we'll have a meeting to discuss those as they're developed if necessary. So I've included here a timeline for previous work on commitment cost enhancements. I thought this was relevant since we've been talking about this in fits and starts, and just having sort of a holistic picture about where we've been on this policy might be useful. For full disclosure, this is something that the ISO has been discussing in policy and legal venues with stakeholders for quite some time. It's changed hands with who's been running it here at the ISO over the course of that period. So there has been some discontinuity, and it's been ongoing for a very long period of time. So we just want to make that known to everybody. And in fact, we actually started policy work on the third phase of commitment cost enhancements way back in 2015. The primary piece of that policy, or a critical piece of that policy, was the opportunity cost adders. And this was, the idea here was to move our existing prior definition of use-limited resources into a new framework where use-limited resources would use additional adders on bids to be used up to, but not in exceedance of, their actual use limitations in the market. So the idea would be that instead of using outage cards to manage use limitations, to be using bids in the market and market dispatch instructions to determine when use-limited resources would be used, and the idea would be that because the market was doing the dispatch, the outcomes would be more efficient than resources who were just simply inserting outage cards and sort of guessing when the most efficient times for usage would be. Tariff language was developed several years after the policy development was started and frankly completed. It didn't start until late in 2017 and then was wrapped up early in 2018. And then there was a lag between when the tariff language was completed and finalized and when the actual policy was implemented, which occurred in April of 2019. Shortly after that policy implementation in April of 2019, the ISO came out and made some modifications to the BPM, specifically around the conditionally available resources or the CAR resources and the outage cards that the CAR resources were eligible to use. Specifically, the BPM clarification stated that those outage cards would be exempt from RAIM. At the same time that we made those BPM clarifications, we also said that we anticipated having some actual tariff clarifications and some documents around the tariff clarifications to go out. And those documents would sort of outline sort of what we anticipated the direction and the intent of the PCE3 policy to be with relation to the use-limited resources and the CAR resources to make sure that expectations were being met from the ISO and that we were following the intent of what we believed was a result of the Commitment Cost Enhancements Phase 3 policy, and then also making sure that the outage cards that were available for use for resources that were conditionally available and for use-limited resources were specified, and that was fully clear. The ISO did publish those tariff clarifications in September 2019, and we had an accompanying stakeholder call in October of 2019. Prior to that call, we had received information from stakeholders about concerns regarding the direction that we were heading, particularly about the exposure to RAIM for some of the resources, the conditionally available resources. After the stakeholder call in October, we also had and heard concerns from stakeholders about the implications this would have on some of their resources. Between October and now, we've had formal comments and a proposal submitted from Southern California Edison, and in that proposal, they outlined some conditions for particular hydro resources that would be considered conditionally available under the current definition, or maybe considered hypothetical resources, and how those hypothetical resources could have concerns about operating under the current framework that we have. So given all of that stakeholder feedback, we did want to open up a formal stakeholder policy, and this is the initiative that we're just starting today. Through that policy, we are going to discuss the changes that we're going to be making to the tariff, and specifically around the outage cards related to CAR resources. We're going to, as Christina outlined, define what those are, what the run-of-river resources are, and we're going to start to think about and outline potentially accounting methodology for hydro resources so that we can accommodate all of the resources that have what used to be framed as, in the old context, use limitations, in the new world where we have use limitations in conditionally available resources and run-of-river hydro resources. And then if there's any other classification that we need, we want to make sure that we can spell out what that could look like or should look like, and make sure we're moving forward on that front as well. So that brings us to the last item here. It's the December 2019 launching of the initiative, and again, hopefully we can close this initiative out in March and get the tariff clarifications in place. But we do anticipate that there could be ongoing work with the CPUC to make sure that we have those accommodations in place for the hydro resources that we're thinking about, so that again, everybody on the system is accommodated under the new framework. So with that, I'll go ahead, and again, that's just a little bit of background, but with that, I'll go ahead and start discussing what what the objective of CCE3 was, and then we'll go through the remainder of the topics for discussion today. So CCE3, so this is Commitment Cost Enhancements 3, was the vision there was to make sure that we were getting as much flexibility and bid-in capacity as we possibly could from use-limited resources. In the past, I think use-limited resources had primarily been used with outage cards, so when the use limitations were close to being reached, or when it was perceived that market conditions may not be optimal. I think the use limitation cards were used to keep those resources out of the market. But CCE3 came up with a new methodology where use-limited resources, either limited by the amount of energy that was available, the amount of starts that were available, or the amount of run hours that were available, would have adders onto their bids into the market, and those adders would be sufficiently high that the resources wouldn't exceed their limited number of uses, either energy starts or run hours. We could envision two, again, hypothetical resources that could potentially be use limited. One could be a gas resource with a certain number of starts. So, you could have a gas resource that has 100 starts over the year, and that's its limitation. So you could think about a particular adder on the startup cost of that resource that would prevent it from being started on most days or most times, and then that adder would be sufficient so that it only got dispatched or to start 100 times or less during the year. Similarly, you could have a resource, a hydro resource with a certain amount of pondage and a particular limited amount of energy that it could use over the course of the summer. Let's say it rains during the winter and the spring, and then over the summer, the dry periods of the year, you only have a particular amount of energy to use, and you could envision the same sort of thing where there's an adder on that resource's energy bid, and that adder is sufficient such that the energy is dispatched when prices particularly high, but it's not dispatched during other times, and that dispatch comes up with an optimal way that would be less than or equal to the total amount of energy that was available from that use-limited resource. Of course, you could have concerns, and again, this is thinking about what the policy looked like initially from Commitment Cost Enhancements Phase 3. Of course, you could have concerns that you're building this model on expected prices and what you think prices or startup costs would be in the future. You might not quite get those right. And the ISO with these adders might use up that resource. In the first case, the gas resource with a limited number of starts could be started up. If it had 100 starts for the course of the year, it could be started up maybe 70 times during the first 3 months of the year, and then the resource might say, oh my gosh, you've used me too much. The good news is the ISO has some tools in place, and this again was contemplated in the Commitment Cost Enhancements policy to review those adders that would be applied on a monthly basis. So if a resource was using starts particularly frequently or energy particularly frequently, the adders might go up for the next month. On the flip side of that, if the resource wasn't using as many starts as was anticipated, those adders may actually go down, but they're updated every month for availability. You still, of course, could have issues where, maybe you have a monthly use limitation and that monthly use limitation is being used up too fast. The ISO would, of course, offer outage cards that would be RAIM exempt to those particular resources, effectively because the adder that was applied to either the default energy bid or the start cost or the min load was not sufficient to keep that resource out of the market and not use up all of the use limitations. So we do have that under consideration. The way that these are constructed, the adders are constructed, is a relatively straightforward process where the ISO looks at historical, if we're thinking about a particular amount of energy, the ISO would look at historical pricing data. So if it's energy over the course of a year, you'd look at pricing data over the course of the prior year, and you could scale that up by what anticipated prices would be for the future, and then you sort of do a stack ranking where the highest prices are at the top of the stack, and then you order those prices in descending order, and then if you've got a particular number of energy to dispatch, you can determine the lowest price at which you would want to dispatch, considering something like maybe the resource is dispatched always at full output or something. Similarly, you could do the same process with start costs or min load costs. Moving on to the next slide, we just walked through a very simple example of what an opportunity cost would look like for energy limitations. So consider you do have a hydro resource, and let's just say a very simple opportunity cost example. It can be dispatched at most 3 hours during any particular day. That day, we anticipate that prices, the three highest price hours to be $70 per megawatt hour, $60 per megawatt hour, and $55 per megawatt hour. And then let's just assume for simplicity here that the resource has a $0 per megawatt hour marginal operating cost. If the resource, let's just say hypothetically the resource was dispatched in an interval when the prices were actually only $20, then by doing that dispatch, the resource would use up one of its hours of availability, and then it wouldn't be able to discharge during that hour or run during that hour when prices were $55 per megawatt hour. So effectively, here the opportunity cost for that resource to run would be what it's giving up, which would be the $55 in revenue during that later, higher priced hour in the day. So the idea would be, for this specific example, that applying an opportunity cost adder that would get the energy bids for this specific resource up to $55 would prevent the resource from running anytime prices were less than $55. But if prices were 70, 60, or 55, then the resource would run, so it would be run during those three highest price hours of the day. And then the other byproduct of this is that you get an efficient dispatch from the resource because the resource is able to still bid in all 24 hours of the day. It's able to bid in at its actual costs, which include opportunity costs, and then the market's doing the dispatch rather than the resource guessing which 3 hours it thinks are going to be the highest price and entering outage cards for the other 3 hours. Yeah, I'll take a pause here for questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, so again, if you have a question, you can raise your hand by pressing #2. Addenda, let me know if anybody enters the queue. Do we have anybody in the queue, Addenda?
We don't have any questions in the queue currently.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. So let me make sure. Okay, so we're on the next slide here. So if we apply opportunity cost adders to use limited resources, the idea here is that they'll be able to provide the system with additional flexibility. Again, like I just talked about, these resources would have the ability to bid in, specifically that example resource would have the ability to bid into the market 24/7. We think that this could be applicable to other resources with those use limitations that are spread out over months or a year as well. The idea would also be, well, if these resources could bid into the market on a 24/7 basis, they should also be subject to RAIM if they're not bidding into the market for any particular reason. So the plant's out on maintenance. The idea would be that we would expect this resource to be there 24/7. If they're not there, they could provide substitute capacity, or if they're not there and they don't have any substitute capacity, they should be exposed to the RAIM mechanism, which is the ISO's penalty mechanism for resources that aren't available during the availability assessment hours, which are specific to the type of resource adequacy that the resource qualifies for. We would anticipate that these resources would remain exempt from the ISO's RA bid insertion tools because these resources are use limited. We didn't feel like bid insertion was appropriate for these particular resources. And then, of course, we get back down to the risk that, hey, what if these resources are run too frequently and an outage card really does need to be taken to make sure that they're not used in excess of their true use limitation. So if this is a gas resource with a permitting issue that only has a certain amount of starts, it can't run over that amount of starts, and it's already very close to that amount or maybe at that limit, and it would obviously need an outage card for that reason. The ISO did think about that, and the idea was that any kind of outage card for a use limited reached or a use limited nearly reached would be RAIM exempt, and that would be available to the use limited cards. So we also acknowledged that not all limitations could be modeled in the use limited framework. You still had certain resources, such as a gas resource, for example, again, two more hypothetical resources. You could potentially have a gas resource that has certain limitations that prevent it from operating during certain hours. Let's say a gas resource has a noise restriction and it's not permitted to run after 10 o'clock p.m. That might be fine for some resources because the availability assessment hours may not be during the time that this particular resource has its use limitation. The idea here would be that this would fall under a new categorization that wouldn't be use limited, but would be instead conditionally available, and conditionally available resources like this would have access to a conditionally available outage card. So if it's after 10 o'clock, this particular example resource would enter in the conditionally available card. Again, very similar to the prior conversation I just had, this resource would be expected to substitute capacity if it was during availability assessment hours, and would be still on the hook to provide that RA during the availability assessment hours. If it was there, if it was indeed offline for conditionally available reasons. However, if it wasn't available, the idea would be that it still would be subject to the RAIM penalties if it wasn't there. Similarly, you might have a hydro resource with regulatory water flow restrictions, the same thing. Perhaps during some certain times, that resource is just not capable of producing above a certain amount. If that were to happen, for the additional amount that the resource was incapable of generating, there would be a conditionally available outage card available to that resource that it could use. Again, this resource would be on the hook to find capacity if it needed to, because it was shown for RA and it was during the availability assessment hours, and it also could be subject to RAIN if it didn't substitute capacity there. These, we're going to note in these two examples that these constraints are different and distinct from use limitations. So use limitations, we were talking about the hypothetical scenario where over the course of a year, a resource has a certain amount of run hours. It can use those run hours during any time. The idea is that the market finds the hours when the prices are the highest, and those are the hours when the resource is dispatched. This isn't for conditionally available resources. This isn't saying that. This is saying that during specific times of the day, I am not capable of producing at all, which is fundamentally different than what we're thinking about for use limitations. So that's the direction that we were thinking about, again, from the perspective of the Commitment Cost Enhancements Phase 3 policy for conditionally available resources. And this is something that was spelled out for usage in the tariff language that was put out. And then as that interim step, as I mentioned earlier, we did make some BPM changes that allowed for conditional available resources to have the availability of outage cards that were RAIM exempt. But again, that was meant as a stopgap measure, and the tariff clarifications that we're talking about here are meant to align these requirements with the intent of the PCE3 policy. So the conditionally available resources are required to bid into the market. The idea would still be that they would be able to bid full capacity into the market, and that the conditionally available capacity is not the bidding requirement. So if the resource did have a conditionally available capacity of maybe, say, half of its PMAX, it would still be required to bid into PMAX or to bid into some fraction of PMAX, and then for the remainder of that capacity have an outage card. This is very similar to how the rest of the fleet is treated with regards to outage cards. If there's capacity that's unavailable from the resource, use the outage card so the ISO knows it's not available through that process. So the idea isn't that you just bid into the market at the availability that you have. And we've talked about the rain penalty and that it should apply here. And then finally, we just wanted to specify, and I think we've had some discussions about this already, but resources could potentially be both use limited and conditionally available. So you could conceive of a hypothetical hydro resource. The hydro resource could have a certain amount, a limited amount of energy that could be dispatched over a particular period of time, over a month, over a year. And then in addition to that, it may also have conditionally available characteristics, and those conditionally available characteristics could prevent it from running at particular times, like those environmental restrictions that we talked about. So you could have a resource that categorizes both, and you'd have access to outage cards that would be applicable to both use-limited resources and conditionally available resources, and traditional outage cards available to all resources. And then it would be up to the resource owner to determine which outage card would be appropriate for usage during any given outage. So, Christina, I'll take another pause for questions here.
Thank you.
Yep.
So if you do have any questions, you can raise your hand by pressing #2. We'll just give it a moment. And Addenda, please let me know if anybody does enter the queue.
At this time, we have no questions in the queue.
Great, thank you.
So I'm on slide 10 from the available slide deck, and that's the beginning of the discussion for run-of-river hydro resources. The idea here is that the ISO would treat these resources similar to VER resources or variable energy resources, so these are the wind and solar resources that are on the system today and the ISO. The idea here is that run-of-river resources really can't influence their output, similar to the wind and the solar resources. Generally, there's a forecasted output for those resources, and the resources can generate up to that forecasted output. These resources are generally price takers in the market. When there's fuel available, hydro in the case of hydro run-of-river resources, or wind or solar in the case of VER resources, these are price takers in the market, so they bid in the capability that they have, and they receive the current market prices for that energy. Let's say, for example, a particular run-of-river resource has nameplate capacity and is able to produce at a maximum of 10 megawatts at any given time. However, hydro conditions on the river that the resource sits on could allow the resource at any specific time to actually only generate up to 7 megawatts because of the amount of water that's running through the river at that time. At a later point in the day, at a different hour, perhaps that same hypothetical resource may only be able to generate at 3 megawatts instead of the 7 megawatts. So the idea would be that, similar to the VER resources, these resources could come up with expectations for what their forecasts are. We believe that the hydro resource operators have very sophisticated hydro flow models, and those models would likely give a much better forecast than any potential ISO forecasting could do. So the idea would be that these resources would do their own forecast modeling, and they would be required then to bid up to what those forecast values were for expected water flow. Of course, as I mentioned, they could also bid in downward flexibility. So let's just say that that hypothetical resource was capable of producing in a particular hour 7 megawatts of output. The resource could bid in to dispatch 7 megawatts at any time when prices are higher than $1 per megawatt hour. But if prices did fall below $1 per megawatt hour and were even as low as negative $150 at the price floor, then the resource wouldn't produce and would back down all the way perhaps to 0 megawatts, so that it wouldn't be incurring costs effectively to produce energy. And the key here to note is that the ISO would not be anticipating producing forecasts for these run-of-river hydro resources. Again, those would be something that would be done in-house, but the bidding requirements would be at those forecast levels. So the run-of-river resources, again, similar to the variable energy resources, would not be subject to the rain penalties. run-of-river resources would have historic output methodologies to calculate capacity values for the resources, and again, this would be based on past availability. Obviously, resources, these run-of-river resources that were online more frequently would have a higher potential future capacity values, so there's an incentive there for these resources to be bidding into the market and to be available for dispatch as often as possible, or to have their capacity in the market as often as possible, because if you have that capability in the market more frequently, then you're available to sell more capacity through the resource adequacy market in future years. These resources could apply for flexible status just like other VER resources on the system today. The resource in this case could be, in the example case that we were just walking through, could be dispatched down from 7 megawatts even lower. So there is some flexibility and they can respond to dispatch instructions. So in the event that it's more advantageous for these resources to be bidding in flexibly and for the ISO to have that flexibility, that is a possibility for these resources as it is for VER resources on our system today. Going forward, the ISO may consider alternative counting approaches in the RA Enhancements Initiative. The Resource Adequacy Enhancements Initiative is the ongoing initiative that's active right now here at the ISO, where the ISO is revamping its resource adequacy tools and doing a holistic look at resource adequacy and how it's treated. This initiative is going on in lockstep with initiatives at the PUC, where they are also looking at the resource adequacy from their perspective and how it works, and contemplating changes that would go, again, hand in hand with the changes the ISO is conceiving in the RA Enhancements Initiative. New counting conventions may account for low hydro years or low snowpack years, so that the amount that any particular run-of-river resource qualifies for isn't overvalued. The idea might be that we look at historical output from these run-of-river resources and perhaps use a methodology that more heavily weights years where there's low output or availability from these resources instead of using perhaps a simple average or something like that. So I'll ask if there's any questions on the phone on run-of-river slides, or if there's anything that we potentially missed with the phone outage.
Sure. So if you do have a question, you can raise your hand by pressing #2. But then to let me know if anybody enters the queue.
Kelly, we have no questions.
That's great. Thank you. So we'll go on to the summary of the tariff clarifications, and we're on slide 12 for those following along. So the tariff clarifications proposed in this initiative were the same that we included in the conversation that we had on October, and it stemmed from the paper that we published in September. So this is really just a recap of what we talked about at our last meeting on this, which wasn't officially a part of the stakeholder initiative. Essentially, we've got clarifications to Section 40.6.4 of the ISO's tariff, which applies to the conditionally available resources. We also have the rain exemption that would be implemented for the run-of-river hydro resources and other tariff language around run-of-river hydro. We'd also clarify that CAR resources would or could be assessed RAIM. Again, this is based on the RA showings for any particular resource and the associated availability assessment hours, or AAHs. And then there's also some non-substantive changes that we've included that need to be cleaned up as part of this initiative as well, and those are included at the bottom of the page. So moving on, as I mentioned at the beginning of this call, the discussions between the ISO and stakeholders have been ongoing about the changes that we were initially thinking about in Commitment Cost Enhancements Phase 3 initiative and the clarifications that we were making after the initiative went live. And we've got, frankly, a lot of concern from stakeholders regarding those changes. So we wanted to make sure, so first and foremost, we wanted to make sure that there was an opportunity for the ISO to hear all the concerns that were out there, and an opportunity for the ISO to address some of those concerns, and that's what we want to do through this stakeholder process We've already gotten some of those concerns in written format from Southern California Edison, which we posted on our website, and they put out a formal proposal on some methodologies to potentially ameliorate some of those concerns. But that's sort of what we're doing here and what we're doing today. And I think a lot of those concerns stem from the old paradigm prior to PCE3, where the ISO had a classification for use-limited resources, and that classification sort of blanketed all resources that weren't available, typically on a 24/7 basis, to this new paradigm where we've got a definition for use-limited resources, and those are sort of the resources that we can sprinkle the uses out, over some period of time, and we can do that via the bidding methodology that I've discussed earlier. And then we also have a classification of conditionally available resources, and those resources are resources where they have periods of unavailability, and those again might have been classified under use limitations prior to the PCE3 methodology. So again, we're taking one framework and we're trying to be more prescriptive about how that framework can work in the future. And one of the solutions we've come up with is including these run-of-river hydro resources. But we're going to go through other concerns about specifically hydro resources, and this is primarily what we've heard from stakeholders. So one additional concern that we've heard centers around local capacity. One of the things that we know is that the requirements for local capacity are set on a monthly basis, but the needs are set at the peak, the summer peak month for most local areas, and that requirement is set the same for all 12 months of the year. Now, it might not actually be the case that the ISO needs that same amount of capacity to be available during all 12 months of the year. And obviously, the resources on the system, in some of these local areas have been around for a long time, and they've been sufficient to serve the needs in some of these local areas for a long time, and nothing has really changed. So it doesn't make sense necessarily that there would be concerns there. But entities generally, because of the bidding requirements and the not bidding requirements, because of the RA requirements that are set in the local areas, entities may not have the ability to show less than the total amount of capacity during any given month. If that is to happen because of the requirements, then you might have to show a lot of capacity, and if these are conditionally available resources, those resources may not be available all hours of the day or all periods of that month, and then they may also be exposed to rain penalties during that period, which is a concern, and that's the concern we heard from stakeholders. One of the things that the ISO is suggesting that in specific months when excess capacity is not needed, entities have the ability to use planned outage cards and effectively derate hydro projects or other resources so that they align with expected energy availabilities during that month. Now, obviously, if this is a local area that has a summer peaking need and those resource adequacy requirements were set on that summer peaking need, it's unlikely that the ISO would be approving would be approving outage cards, planned outage cards at that time because the need is there. But on shoulder months, it may be the case that the ISO really doesn't need all of the capacity that it would need in the summer months, and some of those resources could go on planned outage. I'll pause and see if there's any questions there.
So then let me know if anybody enters the queue.
We do have one question in the queue. I'll go ahead and unmute. Caller, your line's open. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair for the 6 cities. Just to make sure that we are looking at the right proposed tariff language, could you identify the specific date that was posted? I mean, I'm under the impression that you're essentially re-proposing revised tariff language that was posted previously, but it would be very helpful to have the specific date.
Yeah, Bonnie, I can do that. I think we have a list of all the participants on this call and the participants who've been involved in this stakeholder initiative. So what we can do is send out an email that's tailored to that list, and we can point out the specifics in the tariff language that we've proposed here, and all the methodology and documentation around this proposal. I will say the ISO, as you probably noticed, has updated its stakeholder initiatives website, and I think through that updating, we've had different pieces of this specific initiative in different places, and I think we're working right now to get that cleaned up. So eventually it'll all be in one place and very evident what items we're talking about. But in the meantime, we can send an email to clarify that.
That would be really helpful. I have to say I'm not a fan of the new format, but I guess that's a broader issue. But, yeah, I had trouble figuring out where this was coming from, and I wouldn't guess I'm the only one, but maybe I am. Anyway, yeah, some follow-up on that would be helpful. Thanks.
Bonnie, this is David. I believe that when we had the tariff call on this several months ago, I think you had raised some sort of more technical questions about the tariff drafting, and I believe that some of those things were reflected in sort of the current internal draft we have that wasn't, because I don't think we reposted the tariff language itself. So when we repost, I think it will be slightly different than what was posted several months ago. I think it was some of your comments that we sort of took and processed and then just hadn't reposted yet. So there will be, I think, some minor differences between what we'll then go ahead and repost, in the next day or so, and what was posted.
Oh, great. Okay, so you're planning to repost the whole package?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
And this is a work in progress, as we develop from this straw proposal to a draft final proposal, we'll continue to enhance that tariff language and, of course, have a refreshed version out there then as well.
Terrific.
Any other questions, Agenda? Thanks, Bonnie.
We currently have no further questions in the queue.
Great. Yeah, as I mentioned, Southern California Edison and others, and we've been in conversations with other stakeholders as well, have noticed and noted that this policy may not accommodate all hydro resources. So the idea here, again, is that, moving to a framework that we have conditionally available resources and we have use-limited resources, but maybe we don't have other flavors of resources specifically to hydro resources could be problematic. So SCE has pointed out that, this specific issue, and they said, well, hey, if there is a hypothetical hydro resource, there can be all kinds of complications for modeling that resource. And again, these modeling complications may not fit into the use-limited framework or the conditionally available framework or some combination of the two. For example, hydro resources, they can be very complex. They can have downstream and upstream flow requirements. So there could be precipitation falling, there could be upstream resources, there could be downstream resources, there could be environmental standards that these things have to operate to, fishing requirements, recreational requirements, there could be regulatory requirements for water rights, and then obviously you've got the complications of then not just managing one specific resource at a hydro complex, but several resources could be operating in a cascading fashion where the operations of one specific resource could impact the operations of another resource, and you might not be able to get full capacity out of all the resources put together at any given time based on what some resources are doing. So these things are incredibly complex. It might not be feasible for the ISO to capture or model these resources with the current constructs that we have, and it might just not be practical either, so it might not be something we even want to think about doing because of how complex these resources can be. We also know that hydro resources also have regulatory hurdles. Regulators may desire hydro resources to show or sell all available net qualifying capacity for the RA construct for the entire hydro resource, which can be problematic for the resources. So if all of the capacity for the resource is shown in an RA showing, then as we've mentioned, all of the capacity of the resource is obligated to bid into the market, and if it doesn't, because of some conditionally available resource or any of these complexities that I just outlined, then it could be exposed to rain, which could be very financially harmful to the resource owner. If it doesn't show all of its capacity, the resource could be in trouble from regulators, and they could get a lot of heat there. So today, as I said, there's a strong push from those regulators to show as much capacity as possible. So I'm on slide 15 now. So I just want to say that the ISO has heard these challenges, and we acknowledge that these challenges really don't fit into the frameworks that we've outlined, and we want to work with stakeholders to come up with a methodology that could be implemented and used that would fit all or most hydro resources in California that are operating today. What we'd like to do is we'd like to use this initiative as at least a starting point, if not a starting and a finishing point, for a collaborative platform to actually develop a potential alternative counting methodology for hydro resources. And we want this to be something that we get engagement from all stakeholders on. And then eventually, as I've said, we want this to be a solution that would work for all hydro resources on the system. So we are requesting stakeholder feedback on a potential counting or calculation methodology for resource adequacy that could be adopted by resources in the future. We'd also ask that any solution that is eventually adopted and developed doesn't necessarily supersede existing market mechanisms. So for example, a new counting mechanism might actually discount the amount of resource adequacy that any particular hydro resource could qualify for. Any, I would say, non-run-of-river hydro resource could qualify for. If that happens, it might be, you could conceive of a situation where it could be advantageous for a resource that is use limited today under the current definition of use limitations to sort of go with the traditional accounting methodology, which might in fact allow them to have more capacity than an accounting methodology that only looks at availability from prior years. So if that's the case, we want to make sure that we leave the existing accounting methodology open for perhaps these resources that don't have the complexities that are outlined by Edison. But if this is needed, it is something that we get behind rapid adoption of at the PUC, because obviously accounting methodologies have to be adopted and implemented at the PUC. But it is something that the California ISO could work with stakeholders to develop through this stakeholder process. So the idea would be that the new option that we're contemplating wouldn't be or would be exempt from the RAIN tool. So because the counting methodology would be looking at historical performance or historical availability, they wouldn't have any sort of RAIN obligations. And then, we just want to make sure that the differences are acknowledged before we go down this path, and clearly have a defined path that we're taking. So on to slide 16, the SDE proposed methodology is outlined here, and essentially what it does is it puts weight on the most recent 3 years of availability, and what it does is it says, well, the most recent year of availability for the hydro resource would count for 50% of what the resource could qualify for as capacity in the RA market for the upcoming year. 2 years ago, that would be a weight of 30%, and then 3 years ago, for availability numbers, that would be a weight of 20%. They suggest that these calculations could be done on a seasonal basis. So there is a seasonality to generation from hydro resources. Typically, they're available more often in the summer months and less often in the drier months before the spring and the winter when the rain really starts to fall. So I think we would be amenable to accommodating something like that. So the objective is that our rain tool ensures the ISO receives the capacity shown either from specific resources that are shown in the RA plans or substitute capacity, so that we essentially get all of the capacity that's required from the RA requirements, and it ensures reliability on our system. So that idea should sort of be captured in accounting methodology, and that's where we get to the last bullet here on this page. But the ISO really wants to put out there its preference, or its strong preference, for a methodology that includes additional weights on sort of what we're calling low hydro years. So instead of just a blanket accounting of what has happened historically, perhaps we'd like more weight on what's occurring in low hydro years. That would make it more likely that what's shown for RA would actually show up in the market and be available in future years, and wouldn't be sort of derated as part of a particularly low hydro year. One potential idea that we had, and again, we haven't put a ton of thought into this, and these are proposals here, and potential proposals, but one idea that we had was potentially weighting the lowest year out of the last 3 years at 50% for availability, and then weighting the additional 2 years out of the past 3 years of availability at 50%, and that could be what's used for the RA capability in future years. And again, this might more accurately reflect the minimum amount of availability from hydro resources in any particular year. Any questions or comments there?
We do have one question in the queue. The line right now. Caller, your line's open. Please go ahead.
Gabe, it's Eric from Edison. First of all, thank you very much for putting this together. I appreciate it. There's just a couple of issues on here that I wanted to bring up. First of all, on this page, just to make it clear, the SEE methodology, the way you've got it written, sounds like it's 50% on the most recent, 20% on 2 years prior, and 20% on 3 years prior. The 3-year prior we had envisioned as not being the third year, it would be a dry hydro year. So it really is, between the ISO's proposal and Edison's proposal, the difference really is effectively placing 50% weighting on a dry year versus 20% on a dry year. In the way this is written, it makes it look like we don't account for a dry year at all. So that was number one. Number two, going back a couple of pages, I just wanted to mention that you've got in there the pressure of regulators to show the amount of RA. I think in addition to that, what we need to consider is the fact that with a large number of LSEs out there, there's increasing pressure to sell excess positions. And the problem when you're subject to RA AIM that could be extraordinarily costly is, what is your excess position to begin with? And trying to price in exposure to RA AIM into those sales is an incredibly difficult thing to do, and that was why coming up with a better number that we would know for certain what we could actually sell is an important thing to do. So I wanted to point that out, that it's not all just the regulator, it's also the desire of other load-serving entities to purchase excess positions, and the desires of those entities owning excess positions to sell them without undertaking enormous risk.
Yep. Great. Well, thank you very much for those comments, Eric. I apologize. I think the description that I have on page 15 is just a typographical error, and it might have been due to my misunderstanding of the proposal. So obviously we'll have some time to work through that, but I appreciate your clarifying that on this call. That's helpful. And then, yeah, I think that other additional point that you made, that there's a lot of pressure to sell excess positions, and complications in determining what those are is a good one as well.
And we did have other changes to these slides right before the call, so we will go ahead and make some updates and repost them. Any other questions?
We currently have no further questions in the queue.
Okay. I would also add that this is something that this topic of counting methodologies for hydro resources is something that may be discussed in the upcoming CPUC RA process. I know there's a pre-hearing for that on Monday, and there's sort of been a call for if there are potential discussions in a working group there on this topic. So that is something that the ISO is interested in. Carl Mewson from the ISO will be at that meeting to potentially discuss that with anybody who wants to talk about it. And then I know Eric, I don't mean to speak for you, but Eric from Southern California Edison, who's put together the proposal that we've got, may also be available. And then I talked yesterday with Peter Griffiths from Pacific Gas and Electric, and he may also be available to talk about this. But the idea really would be that through some process, both the ISO and stakeholders would come up with something where we come up with a workable methodology for these hydro resources that would be applicable going into the future. With that, I will turn it over to Christina, and then I think we'll pause one more time before we wrap up for any last questions after Christina's done.
Okay, so next steps for this initiative, we are asking stakeholders to provide written comments on the straw proposal as well as the discussion today. We are going to put out a comments template out on the initiative webpage, so look for that hopefully by end of today, but if not in the next couple days. And then if you could submit those by January 6th using the email provided on this slide, that would be great. Again, we did record the meeting. We're going to make that recording available out on the initiative webpage. And then also, Gabe mentioned we're going to send out an email after we post the revised draft tariff language with links to how you can find information out on our website. So as soon as that's posted, we'll email out that information. So any other questions?
We do have one question in the queue. I'm not using the line. Caller, your line's open. Please go ahead.
Hi, Gabe. Steve Greenlee, CES. Just a real quick process question. Well, I guess first, I know you're kind of talking about the parallel CPUC process and possibly establishing a new QC methodology for hydro. But is it the CAISO's intent also to kind of establish, because the CAISO tariff can specify default QC methodologies, so is it the CAISO's intent to, subsequent to this process concluding, update the tariff to reflect any methodology, or is it more just kind of vetting it for input into the PUC policy? Does that make sense?
I think that, I think so. I think that would be one consideration that we would be looking at through this policy. So I think, comments around that would be useful for us.
Okay. And just because the timing seems a little off, I think you're intending to take this to the board in March, whereas I think the anticipation is track one proposals that I presume Edison and perhaps BG will pursue, I think are due in February. So, yeah, I was just trying to see how the processes align. But
yeah, the timing for that, as you mentioned, may work out fairly well for the track one items because as you can note here on this slide that we have up right now, the idea would be that we would wrap up most of the policy development in late January, but to your point, there may still be questions outstanding about all of these counting rule things, which might be fairly complicated once we get into the details.
okay, and perhaps based on comments, you'll have a clearer idea on process come January when you post
exactly
your proposal. Okay, all right, thank you.
Yep, so stay tuned on that, Stephen. Great question, thank you.
Any other questions?
Currently, there are no further questions in the queue.
All right, well, we wrapped up early. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Adenda.
And that concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.